Hello everybody, in this video tutorial I would like to explain you how to paint miniatures in 10mm. I know, something smaller than 28mm, so something really small or tiny details. So in these video tutorials I would like to explain you, give you the possibility to understand, at least now, how to paint details. What means, for example, if you want to paint an emblem, a gem, a chain, something like that, maybe in some moments you feel that you can't define perfectly every detail. So this is very common. So this is why you don't understand well how work with the dark linings. So this kind of outlining, you have to understand it as much control or contrast than you usually do. And in these video tutorials, I'm going to explain you how you should do. Okay? So first step, the first tip that I should give you, it's if you're painting something really small, smaller than a 28mm, something like a emblem, something like a detail on a miniature, for example the face, or like a chain, stuff like that, that have a lot of detail in a tiny place. So if you have something like that, the first tip is paint with more contrast. And maybe you are thinking that, yeah, Sergio, you always told about contrast and I have to paint with more contrast. Okay, it's true, but in this one, much more. Okay, much more contrast. You have to paint like you can see on the screen. So if you see the base coat I used, I've painted with something really cold and darker than usually, right? If you want to paint a skin like this tonality. And then the base coat, it's something like a mid-tone. So this huge contrast, it's the contrast that you have to understand when you want to paint emblems or tiny details. Because as much contrast you create, much focus will be the result. If you can't create this contrast, then will look like blurry, like you painted with not much enough contrast. So to create something that everybody can see from this from some distance, okay, it's paint with more contrast than usual. When you want to paint something bigger, when you are painting like a bust or a 70 or 28mm, in each scale you have to paint with different contrast, always with a lot of contrast, but you have the possibility to add more capibases, more layers between each one. For example, in a bust, maybe you can paint with 20 layers for sure, but in a model like this one in 10mm, it's impossible. So maybe you will paint with 5 layers or maybe 8. But in these 8 layers, you have to create the same contrast or a bit more contrast than the contrast that you use on a bust or a 75mm. So, and for that reason, I've decided to create a video tutorial about that because I think it's a nice tip for you to paint not just 10mm models, okay, because maybe you won't find a lot of models in that scale, but for sure if you translate this to something more specific like tiny details, like for example a chain, I think could be really nice. For example, if you see the video tutorial, you can see his chest, belly, arm and hand, and you can find something in common. You can see perfectly a dark lining between each part on the shadows. So if you have to paint something more like armor or a chain, something like that, you have to define perfectly the dark lining between each part. But if you have to paint something more organic, like a skin in that case, I recommend you do exactly the same as if you are painting a chain, but then you have to link them to try to fix the armor effect, okay? You have to paint the skin, not the muscles. So everything on the body works together. So for that reason, you have to connect them, okay? So first step, with a copy base, paint places where you feel that you have to paint the light. If I have to give you my opinion, 90% of the model. And then the tiny places, you have the possibility that I'm going to explain you later. So will be the glazing with the 50-50 dilution that I explained you. But this is just if you have to paint something more like skin or you have bigger places to continue working on that. If you have to paint, for example, like a eagle emblem, for example, and you have to represent the wings, how you have to paint the wings? First, paint a really dark base coat, then repaint everything less the dark linings or outlinings. And this new layer should be something like this, with this huge contrast. Then I recommend you, if it's something like an emblem, like gems, like chains, stuff like that, something more like armors, more synthetic with edges, I recommend you paint the edge highlights with a lot of contrast. For example, if you want to represent something like non-metallic metal, I recommend you start with something like really dark, something like dark brown, Rhino's hide, English uniform, colors like that, or maybe darker. Then paint with the color that you want. For example, with, I don't know, a mid-gray, gold, whatever, okay? Just a color lighter with the color that you want. I don't care if it's super saturated with a lot of light, don't care. The only thing that you have to think about that, it's enough contrast. So with a lot of contrast, if you paint something lighter, will be better, okay? Because then with the airbrush, because yes, I'm going to use the airbrush after all that. So you can add more nuances or tonalities or bring down this light. So it will be easier than if you paint with low contrast. So then paint the edge highlights with a lot of contrast too. And for example, if you are painting something like white, remember, a lot of contrast or much more contrast doesn't mean paint with white and black. Please remember that. If you're painting something like yellow, don't try to paint the dark linings with black too. Okay, remember that. So if you want to paint something like yellow, remember, use a dark brown. If you're painting with a white color, remember, use a dark gray, but never a black color, okay? So then, when you have something like that, more or less the skin is done, it's the time to feel the model finished. How you can feel that from the beginning? Just painting every detail, just that. So if your emblem has more elements, try to paint them just with a base coat, just to draw the dark lining. With that will be enough. So in that case, if you see, I'm painting the mouth, tongue, eyes, ears, everything. With different colors will be okay. If you want to use exactly the same color for the ears, will be okay too. That means just paint everything to have the dark lining, to draw perfectly every detail. When you have finished that part, you will see much better the definition on your model, so it will be helpful to you to understand everything in a complex model or in a complex element. Then it's just, do you have more room to continue work on that? Do it. Continue painting new layers. You feel that you can't paint more layers, just paint the edge highlight. Then, if you feel that you can paint 2 layers, maybe else, paint them. Just that, okay? So the key on something really tiny like this will be the dark lining. Once time you have painted well the dark lining, so well means with a lot of contrast, enough contrast like you can see, and in tiny places to get better definition will be done. So just with that will be okay. But because I would like to bring you more and more information on my models, I'm going to continue painting new layers. So how you have to paint or how you have to blend every capibase on a model like that. If you can't paint more layers, you don't have to blend with your brush. Just with the dark lining and with the airbrush. After all of that will be okay. But however, if you want to continue painting new layers to create more volumes, better shapes, for example on his hands, I think that we can continue working on that, like maybe 3 or 4 layers else. So we can paint them, we'll try to paint them. Don't care if you paint with much more contrast than you usually do, because remember, you have the airbrush to bring down that contrast if you feel that you painted with too much. My idea is when you paint something really small, smaller than a typical model or tiny details, if you paint with that huge contrast, will be more focused, more needed, so everybody will see better than if you paint with lower. So for that reason, try to paint with saturated colors now, so in the mid-tones, and then going up you will lose the saturation because you will start to adding colors with white inside. So you will lose that saturation. So I recommend you at the beginning, paint with the saturation and then with something desaturated. But this is just because you will need something more like skin tones, pale flesh, colors like that, ivories. So you will have a lot of white inside and you will desaturate the color. So if you see, I'm trying to represent the shape, repainting the 90% of the previous layer. Always trying to do the same. If you have the possibility to do it. If you can't do it, try to paint, as I said, the dark lining, mid-tone and highlight. Just that, on the edging, just that. So you don't have to paint much more. This is the key when you want to paint a chain, for example. If you want to paint that chain, I recommend you paint with a really dark brown or color close to black. Then try to paint with the color that you want on your chain, or a bit darker maybe, because you want to paint a non-metallic metal, so maybe darker in that case will be better. Paint everything less the dark linings between each part, each stuff. Then, if you have the possibility to paint the edge highlights on every part of the chain, will be much better. This layer will be lighter with a lot of contrast to see perfectly the edge highlight, the mid-tone that you painted to draw the dark linings and the dark linings. So now you have 3 steps on your chain or on your detail. Then, if you have the possibility to add a new one, for example, in the case that the chain, I recommend you use just pure white to represent some brights in some places. So you will use that bright in some places, tiny places on the edging or in the mid-tone, in tiny places. So you will have 4 layers, perfectly define them with a lot of contrast in a tiny place. So this, in a tiny place, your eyes will blend everything, but you have the other tool, the airbrush. With the airbrush we can blend in some places to represent mid-tones around this chain, because the technical part you did it well. So then it will be super easy to use them with this kind of glazing, because it will be faster and I think with better results. Okay, so on your model, in a model like this one, 10 millimeters, a miniature like this one, you have to represent something more like skin. So the key that paint just the dark linings, mid-tones and edge highlights maybe won't work. So we have to paint something more organic, right? So how we can do that? Exactly the same as the previous layer. Paint everything, removing the 90% less the dark linings, then paint a new layer, and then between each layer, paint with the glazing with the 50-50 dilution. So how you have to work on that, like that? So if you have seen the video tutorial, you have seen that previously in the first layer, I've painted everything with a color, and then I use this dilution to blend, going from the shadow to the color. Why I said the color? Because I'm using exactly the same color. So with this new layer, I've painted with a capibase as regularly, and then I'm going to use the glazing like you can see now with the 50-50, going from the previous layer, the mid-tone or base coat, not the base coat, the previous layer, going to this color like you can see on the belly now. With this you will get like a blending, really easy, faster, I think not perfectly for sure, but will be super easy to do it. And because it's tiny, it's something really tiny, you will have easy control to do it, because it's just starting a shadow, going to the light. Then you will use the airbrush to continue blending around everything. And I'm going to explain you how you have to blend, because when you have something like this, you have to understand that blend with airbrush means remove detail. So you will get something like a blurry effect in some places. So if you use exactly the same colors, you will lose information to try to blend the brushstrokes. Maybe it's a good way, but I recommend you my way. It's using different colors to try to translate or change that losing effect with the brushstrokes to blend, moving to a new color. So you will lose the brushstrokes, you will lose the contrast and some information, but you will add some nuances new. So you will change something for something new. So you will blend the brushstrokes and at the same time you will add new information. But that part I'm going to explain you with airbrush because it will be easier when you are watching that. Okay, so you can see my fingers, you can see how tiny is that model, and this is how I work with capibases always. I don't like glazing at the beginning because for me it doesn't make sense. It's much more interesting, or on the good way, represent every shape as you like it and then blend. How you have to blend? You don't have to be crazy trying to blend everything, because as I'm showing you on this video tutorial, it's just going from the previous layer to the new one with exactly the same color with a dilution like 50-50 or 70-30, don't care, because the drop with the water and the pigment will stop in the place where you have 100% with exactly the same color. So that area can't absorb more pigment. This is the reason why I use the capibasing and this kind of uniform base coats on every layer. This is more or less the result now. With this zoom, you can see that works perfectly. Remember, you are watching that model with a huge zoom, so you can see the brush to compare the model. If you see that model just on your hands, just with these capibases, you will see that everything was blended. But because I would like to bring you something more, remember, use the airbrush then, because it will help you a lot. So if you see the kind of the brush strokes I use, I don't like to use the brush strokes to create like a shark teeth or like crest on every brush stroke. I try to create them more like circles, like more organic, because if you try to create lines, it will be perfect to represent effects, like for example on steel or stuff like that, but I don't recommend you on the skin, because blend this kind of effect with lines will be really difficult to blend it with airbrush, because on the areas where you have the line wider will be great to add a tonality, but in area that appear the shadow, you won't do anything there. So you will keep this kind of brush strokes with lines until the end. So I don't recommend you to create the feeling that this is skin. If you have to paint something different like steel, non-metallic metal, another kind of details, will be great. Maybe great. Okay, so this is the result. This is how I'm working on that. I think just with this layering, it's okay, but I would like to explain you in the next video tutorial just some steps else, and then the airbrush. So I hope it's a great video tutorial for you to paint tiny details, miniatures smaller like this one, and will be helpful for you to understand now how you have to work when you have to paint tiny elements or details, stuff, okay? Because I think is the key. Paint with these dark linings, the contrast, and sometimes you paint with lower contrast than you should do, okay? So, and this is how I work. I hope you have enjoyed watching this video tutorial and surprise you with the result at the end of the airbrush. So see you in the next video tutorial. Thank you very much for your huge helpful, and I hope you have enjoyed watching this one, and see you in the next one. Okay, bye bye.